So good evening, everyone. Thank you so much for having me here virtually to talk about the wonderful job I have as print curator. I have the honor and privilege of stewarding a collection of roughly 60,000 prints at Harvard from the medieval to contemporary era. The collection I oversee is almost exclusively European by the numbers, as the Japanese print collection falls under the purview of other colleagues, but we do have a wonderful collection of Japanese prints. The print collection is well known for its strengths in the 16th, 17th, and 18th centuries especially. And there are some long-standing priorities for growing and expanding the collection that I've been working on with colleagues for quite some time. Prints by artists from underrepresented groups, American prints, especially masterpiece prints that are considered just truly extraordinary impressions, and especially prints by contemporary artists who are outside Europe and the United States. These are things, like I said, that I've been working on for a long time with colleagues. It's been quite a joy to push the boundaries and to push the previous limits of the collection further. Before I introduce you to some of the projects I'm working on, I want to say one more thing about the print collection. While it's mainly a European collection, there are interesting connections to all parts of the non-European collection through the works. I'll highlight just one of those now. This is a print, a Japanese print, that I recently acquired with my colleague Rachel Saunders, the curator of Asian art at the museum. It's a Japanese reinterpretation of the 18th century Italian print that you see on the right by the artist Vicentini. His engraving is after Canaletto's view of the Grand Canal in Venice with a view of Santa Croce, the Church of Santa Croce. It's a fascinating example of the exchange between artists not long after Canaletto's work. And it's also a wonderful example of the dissemination, the reach that prints had globally. We tend to think of the contemporary moment being global, but this is not an invention of our moment, but certainly goes way back to, of course, medieval period. And even before that, cultures have been connecting with one another and exchanging their goods, exchanging, of course, their artistic influences and much more. So we don't have the print on the right in the collection, but we do have an impression of it at Houghton Library, which is across the street from the museum. So when this opportunity arose to collaborate with Rachel and to bring this really beautiful print into the collection, it just was sort of a no-brainer. It was a wonderful thing to add to the collection and think about teaching with it together. Mentorship and teaching are a big part of my daily work. We are, after all, a university art museum, and we have a mission, a dedication, a purpose to share the collection, to share our knowledge as curators, and that's really a joy of the job. Now I'll turn to some of the projects that I'm working on that I hope you will enjoy at the museum. I hope you'll come to see and enjoy them. So with the COVID pandemic, which brought necessary adjustments to our exhibition calendar, and the Harvard Art Museum's only reopened on September 4th after an 18-month shutter. So I'm in the middle of a very busy year. Once everything got reshuffled and reorganized, I have 3 exhibitions in a row, a small, medium, and large. The first is the smaller one, which is a collections-based show on the left, States of Play, and it's currently on view, and I'm going to talk more about that now. Next spring, I'll have an exhibition installed featuring the major acquisition of prints from the Brandywine Workshop in Philadelphia. This is a contemporary print show that I've been working on with a number of students. We're a team of 5, and it's been a highly collaborative project where we'll have labels written by students, faculty, museum colleagues. Every single print will have a different label by a different author, and every author will be identified on the walls. It'll be quite something. The drafts have been rolling in and they're fantastic, and I can't wait to see how this all comes together. And then the final show on the right, the one I've been working on for many years. I don't want to say how many, it's more than 5. I've been working on a very, very large team for this one. We have an exhibition catalog authored by more than 24 people, young scholars, mid-career and senior scholars. It's a major loan show. It'll be in our special exhibitions gallery. It's called Dare to Know, Prints and Drawings in the Age of Enlightenment. So that's up next September. And now I'll delve into some wonderful examples of how prints can fascinate, entertain, and mystify. Those I'll discuss today are all from the museum's collection, just as the works on view in my current show. States of Play, prints from Rembrandt to Delsarte. The central question of this show is, what is a print state? In answering this question in different ways, the exhibition illustrates the intellectual, technical, and visual fun that artists have had over 5 centuries playing with the possibilities of prints. And I could have curated this show 100 different ways. The collection is extremely strong in states or multiple states. And it was actually quite fun to have to settle on an object list for this, but this is one that many of my colleagues at the museum would like to see redone in different ways. And it's an idea I'm sort of thinking about as the show is up. This is where the show is installed. So on the 3rd floor of the museum in our exhibition galleries, what's called our University Research Gallery. Just a couple of notes about things I did in this show that were sort of new to the museum or variations on things that we've done before. I tried to make the labels, and here's an example of one, as succinct and as accessible as possible. By accessible, I mean, I was presuming no knowledge about prints for the visitor to this show. And I was really trying to encourage visitors to enjoy the playful complexities of the works on view, rather than trying to decipher print jargon. And I realized in doing this, how much vocabulary there is for talking about prints, and how that can be a real sort of barrier to sharing the creativity, the innovation through this medium. So I did a lot of word definition or term definitions in these labels. You see the highlighted here, first state, and then I tried to define it down there. And a lot of help with these definitions too, I should say, especially with my conservator colleague, Christina Taylor, who is one of my partners on this project. The other thing I did for this show is that I tried to expand its concept by inviting faculty, students, and colleagues to contribute to a digital supplement, which can be accessed through QR codes in the gallery and also on our website. Scanning the codes unlocks additional content about the prints, such as videos, audio, and more. And everything's brief deliberately, so that if someone wants to enjoy these in the gallery, they won't get stuck on listening to their phone for too long. They can move on, listen, take it in, and then move on to the next print. More than 15 people contributed to this supplement, which we threw together quite quickly, but it was a really wonderful experience. And I learned so much more about these prints and hearing colleagues respond to them. Here's an example of how it works. If you click on the icon for Louis Delsart's print, highlighted in red, it'll take you to a page which has a 2-minute audio response from Professor Matt Saunders, a written response by Harvard junior Hannah Chu, and a video of a phenomenal Art Talk Live, which was delivered this past summer by Harvard graduate student Kayla Jackson. So the main question, right? Why do artists make print states, and why do we care? That's really the gist of this show. And to answer these questions, I'll share a few examples with you now, actually several examples. Some are in the show and some are not. Traditionally, the definition of a print state is a draft or a version of a print. But artists have tested, expanded, and upended that definition over centuries. A print state can be different than it is for every printmaker and contingent on circumstance. Comparing states is a central practice for print scholars, but it can be fun and illuminating for everyone. And that is what I aspired to convey in this show. My exhibition opens with this unfinished first state by Anthony van Dyck. The 17th century artist portrayed himself often in paintings, drawings, and prints, but this is my favorite of them all. Though not a professional printmaker, Van Dyck etched the self-portrait himself. His head floats on the empty page, and he turns back to look defiantly at us, the viewer, as if interrupted. The final state of this print, which you see on the right, provides a different, more muted, as in less confrontational context. The copper plate was reworked by the professional engraver Jacobus Niefs, and we now see Van Dyck as a portrait bust perched on a column that bears the title of the suite of prints that follow. That suite is called the Iconography and consists of portraits that Van Dyck executed in other media. He etched many of those plates too, but this title page is still my favorite. And the other plates, he gives at least a cursory sense of bodily form. But here it's just his head and the single line of his collar. To me, it seems as if it's his most hubristic self-portrait, his most bold too, and humorous. Thinking about the evolution of prints through their states, that is from one stage of production to the next, requires close looking and comparison. Working with this fantastic engraving provides a delightful reward because the first state shows the figure wigless, and he isn't just any figure. This is a portrait of the great playwright Carlo Goldoni, one of the most famous authors of the 18th century. And yes, comparing the first and later states of this composition tell you a lot about how the engraver worked up his print, but it's also just entertaining to see this figure, this eminent figure, in an unguarded, underdressed moment. And so one of the questions is, well, why would this exist? Why would this first state even exist? And it's not recorded in the catalog of prints of this artist. My theory is that he would have run the copperplate through the press to check his work at this stage, because this is, like I said, an eminent figure. The resultant print would make money for him, would also potentially earn him new clients. So testing out, seeing where he stood in the process of this portrait, especially when it came to finishing the face and finishing the wig, this would have served as a really useful guide. That's my theory. It's not to say there's not archival evidence for this yet, because as I said, this is an unrecorded first state, but that's sort of my gut on it. The first and the most obvious reason is, like my theory for the Pateri print, that an artist would create multiple states to check the composition, to complete it, to check his work as he or she or they were working. So an artist would run his incomplete print through the press to check the work, assess progress. Charlemagne, the mid-19th century French printmaker responsible for this print, is famous for printing proofs of his etchings as he worked, and comparing them can be great fun for seeing his work and his choices unfold. So from the first to the second state, we see the Tower of St. James, the Tour Saint-Jacques, and the gargoyle being added. There's a closer view of the tower. This is in Paris, and the gargoyle. And you can see that there's a faint outline around the gargoyle's profile right here. As it meets, so where the gargoyle meets the cityscape, there's a sliver of what's called reserve or empty space. This is here that the artist is anticipating further edits to unite and harmonize those two parts of the scene. There are 10 states of this print, reworked over just as many years. So Marion was rethinking, reworking this composition and its narrative throughout all these states and over all this time. In the middle of the process, he added these lines, which he wrote himself. Insatiable vampire, eternal lust, covets its food in the great city. But in the very next state, the title is burnished out or erased. And this moves the narrative from a dark place, where we have a threatening, dangerous vampire believed to be this gargoyle, to an innocuous, arguably caricature, this inanimate thing, this inanimate gargoyle, this sculpture perched on the edge of Notre Dame, on the top of Notre Dame. But it's interesting to consider this shift in the context of mid-19th century Paris when this was made. It was a period of rapid urbanization under the auspices of the Baron Haussmann, whose changes to the city were so radical that the entire process was named after him. It was called Haussmannization. He carved these beautiful, spacious boulevards out of the city that so many of us love today, but this came at a great cost to neighborhoods, including those in view of the spires of Notre Dame from which this gargoyle is perched. I mean, they razed whole parts of the city to create those boulevards, destroyed homes, destroyed businesses. So it's interesting to think about how the titles affect this vision. This is also a print that's known as the Strix, which is a beast from ancient mythology that fed on humans. And I wonder if it's as evocative as a vampire in the context of Gothic literature, which would make this a kind of critique of modernity in modern terms. And Marion was very clear. He did several prints that were deliberately critical of the urbanization in Paris. And this is one major moment in that sustained critique. But I just think that, keeping the title as vampire, even though he did burnish the title out and essentially erase it, is more, to me, it's perhaps a more accurate, or a way, it's not really accurate, but it amplifies his critique if you think about it in terms of contemporary literature. This is another well-known entertaining print of the 19th century. It's the frontispiece of an art journal for the year 1877, and it's titled The Funeral of the Burin. It's a bold proclamation of the superiority of etching, which comes charging at us in the form of the modern steam engine. In the distance, a burin, the instrument of engraving, is being carried away into the sky, and its funeral cortege, with the date 1876, is led by an outmoded horse and buggy. It's just a fantastic, fabulous print. And when I saw the first state on the market, I simply couldn't resist bringing it together with the final state in the collection. To see Bouot's first priorities inscribed on the plate was enthralling. The steam engine with its diaphanous smoke and the Sphinx with the serpent on the tracks below. The Sphinx and the serpent nearly disappear in the final state on the right. They're thrown into that beautiful shadowy burr of the etching needle. So to see where Bouot started with this dark, haunting image is really exciting, and it's incredibly instructive, particularly for teaching. Like we can see the ingredients of his beautiful soup. One of my white whales is a bit of diversion, but one of my sort of academic or intellectual white whales is the first state of this book illustration, one of the most often produced prints in the early 19th century. It's Prud'hon's illustration to the epic poem about star-crossed lovers, Procine and Melidor. It was a contemporary text written in French, but cribbed essentially from ancient tales, a common feature of neoclassical literature at the time. So the story goes that Melidor had been banished to an island where he assumes the identity of a hermit. So that's why he has that heavy cloak. His lover Procine swims across the Strait of Messina, really a tough swim, even for Olympic swimmers today. To be with him, she makes this journey at night, and exhausted from her journey, she nearly dies. And in the illustration, he revives her with his kisses. Well, in the poem, he revives her with the kisses once, and this, well, many times, but it's believed this is the illustration of that moment. But then, of course, the poem concludes with his attempt to revive her, and he's unable. But the print is so famous because it seems to encapsulate everything about Prud'hon's art making. The pathos, the drama, the overwhelming emotion, the moonlit sky. Art history has embraced this version of the artist wholeheartedly since his lifetime, and the image seems to epitomize everything proto-romantic about his practice. Inscribed on the print are statements that Prud'hon etched the image, and his frequent collaborator, Barthélemy Roger, reworked it with engraving. A manuscript by Roger, written at the end of his life, attests the same thing. But there's no first state proving definitively what the artists claim. And the plate has been reworked so much to hide the etched outlines, which was typical of their style, that it's nearly impossible to see those first marks by Prud'hon or Roger. So why is my white whale, I say, because I'd love to find a first state someday, as I know many others would, to try to resolve this lingering question, to prove definitively, okay, yeah, this is exactly how this print came about. Early states, in other words, can often serve as primary evidence, and finding new ones always allows for the possibility of new stories and new narratives. And this is something that print curators and print scholars just, delighted, makes their year if they find a new state of a print. Before we go on, it's worth considering one other aspect, the commercial market. So Bouot and Marion were working in the second half of the 19th century when collecting states had become a thing. Publishers charged different rates for early states, and collectors prided themselves on the rare impressions they could find. So Bouot didn't necessarily print the first state on the right and Marion on the left to check their work. That certainly couldn't have been a benefit. We have to acknowledge that the market value of that first state could have factored into the decision to make it in the first place. They may have wanted to check their work, but they would know in doing so that they could still sell that first state. This large print on the right is a great example of states for money. They are a gesture of bravado in every sense. To show his talent as a reproductive engraver, Robert Strange took on one of the most famous paintings from the previous century, which you see on the left, Van Dyck's portrait of Charles I, a famous British English king who ended up getting killed, beheaded. It's a very, very famous painting that's now in the Louvre. Following academic standards, Robert Strange starts with etching on the left, reworks it with engraving in the middle, and then finds a calligrapher or works with a calligrapher to add an elaborate caption on the far right. The early existence of early states was the result of his braggadocio. He printed them, and he printed them in many impressions, to show how he excelled at this method. And it worked. The Royal Academy in Paris studied this trio as an example of great printmaking. All three states are in my exhibition. And there's not a huge difference from 1, 2 to 3. And I think that just underscores even more how Robert Strange was really playing to a certain audience and a certain clientele. Sometimes states chart a collaboration between artists, such as in this pair. I had hoped to include these works in my exhibition, but in the end I didn't. What you're looking at is a famous pair of states in 18th century art history. The painter Francois Boucher reproduces his painting of Andromeda in an etching on the left, which then the professional printmaker Aveline reworks for sale on the right. This is a famous example because Boucher was an immensely talented etcher in his own right. In fact, he got print commissions before he was getting painting commissions. And he sought out Aveline specifically to prepare prints like this for the market. His collaboration with Aveline displays a key awareness of what print collectors wanted, the kind of look that they were seeking in these kinds of prints. You can see what that means in the detail of a sea monster. The etching is looser, it creates thinner lines that hold less ink, and then the resultant image has less contrast. The burin, the tool of engraving, which is used on the right, creates deeper, wider lines in the copper plate, thus holding more ink and thus creating more contrast in the end. The preferred look of prints that reproduce paintings was this style, and this style had been in place since the previous century. Boucher knew this, and in an effort to sell more prints, he sought out Aveline to rework the etching. Since the 18th century, trends have gone in the opposite direction, and now the first state is a much more highly prized thing than Aveline's reworked version. I was a little too modest to share these details tonight, but Boucher's first state is a lot sexier than the Aveline version too. That charge, that eroticism gets toned down through working. And I would just encourage you to compare states on your computer or come to the museum to see that yourselves, but it's very much, the frisson of the etching is much more proper, muted in the version with the engraving on top. And then there are examples like this proof, which details a collaboration between the painter Paul Signac and the master printer Auguste Clos. Signac did not make this color lithograph. He made a watercolor drawing, which Clos then interpreted in the technique of lithography. And this kind of collaboration was really the result of a publisher, Ambroise Vollard, who was encouraging the Impressionists to work with him. He would set everything up, but to work with him and the master printer Auguste Clos to produce prints, original prints for the market. Vollard really saw an opportunity in the art market for these emerging painters to push prints to another level in another way, but also to, of course, make money. And so proofs like this were essential because Clos is the one making the color lithograph based on a drawing that Signac has provided him, and they weren't in the same place. Like they were not living in the same city at the time. So proofs like this were taken to get the artist, to get Signac's approval and his sign off. Clos would send it to Signac, who marked it up with the sections and the aspects that he wanted changed. And this is all done in the margins. So here are some details. You can see where he circles marks, he circles points in the composition that need to be changed. So he says in one at the top one, he says a dark blue, he wants a different color in that section. And then below he writes, eliminate the red. And these are directives from Signac to the printer, which are then summarized in the bottom of the sheet with a list of annotations, basically saying, this is good to pull or to print once you've done all of these things that I've made clear on the proof. One of print history's most famous collaborations was between master printer David Lucas and the painter John Constable. Together, they produced extremely fine and large mezzotints after Constable's paintings, including his big series of works known as the 6-footers. These were canvases that were 6 feet in length that were aimed to catch the public's eye at public exhibitions. So the painting on the right is one of those 6-footers. So Lucas did the mezzotints. He also wasn't living in the same place as Constable. So he would make mezzotints, which are most likely based on drawings, preparatory drawings for these monumental paintings. He would mail the proofs to Constable, who annotated them and then enumerated all of those changes in his letters. He would mail the things back to Lucas in London. And it's really fantastic because, you know, John Constable is so polite and so charming. Well, both of them are in their letters, they're so nice with each other, but there's such a high level of anxiety that you can also sense in their correspondence. And this is why this is one of the most famous examples, because there's so much evidence of how they work together. So, there were, I'm not sure how many proofs for the Salisbury Cathedral, but at least 10 that were sent back and forth. Not most of them survive. And we haven't been able to line up the proof in Harvard's collection with the exact annotations and the letters. We think it's one or the other. We haven't quite nailed that yet, but he does say of this project, Constable says this project, if we don't get this right, we are sunk. It's just, and it's so wonderful to read the letters where he goes, feeling confident and encouraging and saying, okay, we're really on the right path here. And then, sort of utter despair, but he's always polite and he's always kind, which is another reason that it's just a wonderful, it's a wonderful thing to dive into in history, and everything's been published and is online and fully accessible. Sometimes the kinds of negotiations between printer and designer or painter happen because of decisions made by one artist who is both printer and designer and overall artist. Rembrandt is the king of print states, and he's the king of this sort of thing, of doing it all as the painter printmaker. The changes between states in his prints have occupied generations of scholars since the 17th century to today. And the main reason for this is that everything is up for grabs when he produced his prints. Not just the copper plates or the compositions, but the inks, the paper, the resists, all the materials and the pieces of the process. He played with it all. You're not looking at two different states here, but two different inkings of the same plate. So that's to say, the copper plate, there are no more lines on the copper plate on the left or on the right. The same amount of lines on the copper plate. He's just inked one differently and printed it. And then in the second iteration on the right, he inked a lot, he rubbed a lot of that ink off and then printed it again. This is one of his masterpiece prints, Christ crucified between two thieves. You can see he's going from dark to light, changing the atmosphere and the meaning of this terrible moment. And this is really interesting because, I've actually made this a sort of talking point now with colleagues because, basically saying, which one do you prefer? Do you prefer the really broody 19th century-ish one, or do you prefer, the lighter one? And one colleague, two colleagues actually pointed out to me, the lighter one, the one where my cursor is, this is a more horrific scene. He's made the narrative more intense. And the way he's done that is he's pulled up a light. And so it's daytime. It's not necessarily nighttime. There's no question that it's nighttime, let's put it that way. And that means that everybody there is a witness to what's happening. They have the ability to see what is happening. Whereas in this one, there's perhaps some ambiguity about that, right? It looks like it could be, it's either in a deep storm or it's at nighttime, and it's possible maybe to not take in all of the horror, all of the pain of this moment. I don't know. It's hard because standing in front of them, I'm still just so smitten by this smoky one, the inky one. But this is the way Rembrandt goes. At this point in developing this composition, he sees what the change in inking does here, where he's wiped more away. And this is where he continues to go. And the final state looks more like this one on the right than on the left. This was this moment where he's trying to play with this crucial moment of the printing process, that is to say, ink. So going even further than the Rembrandt example, in some cases, there technically are no states at all. These are 3 prints by Lee Krasner, which are hung toward the end of my exhibition. They're reworkings of the same lithographic stone. And you can see her changes from one to the next, which bleed through as ghost images. So in a standard definition, or a curator like me who's focused on older centuries, you could be tempted to catalog these as 3 states of the same work. They're 3 iterations of the same lithographic stone. And Carolyn, if you have ideas about this, please, I would welcome you to chime in, because I was actually looking at these with Chris Wallace today, because technically they're kind of mind-boggling. Each one's the whole thing's an edition of 15, and that she could get each one, to do this is just kind of amazing. And it's not exactly clear. She didn't just counter etch. She's doing other stuff to make the image disappear but not wholly, and then to add more marks, but not completely. And a lot of it looks washi. So he thought she was playing with spirits at the same time that she's playing with the acid. And
It could be that I'd have to look at them in person, but also what a lot of people would do with litho in this time period, there was a lot of experimentation going on. They were basically really breaking all of the traditional rules that had stood for 150 plus years. And one thing is, with a lot of things, is either you can pull ghost prints, so you haven't inked it up, so it's a faint printing. You could also take it to the sink and either through a strong edge or take a very, very, very fine grit and very lightly grain it, which would knock everything back just a little bit. And then you can work back on top of it and still have what's underneath, but it would be that very, very faint with a very strong on top, depending on what you added. You see what I mean? That's one of the joys of a stone, is you can go forward and backwards at the same time pretty much and still print it.
Yeah, that's totally what she's doing. Like you just said, the forward and the back at the same time. It's exactly right. So
it's the joy of a rock.
That's fantastic. I love that. And I hope you'll comment. I'd love to talk with you more in front of the prints, but also the blue stone is part of a portfolio, which I'm illustrating here. We have the blue stone, the red stone, and the gold stone. So she does this 3 times and reworking each stone 3 different times. But this whole portfolio is a riff on another portfolio that only has 3 prints, the blue, red, and gold. Wow. So it's really, you're really talking about 12 prints all in all. And I'm hoping we can, the first series is called Primary Series, and this is called Long Lines. But I'm hoping we can find at some point join both portfolios at Harvard. But it's such a beautiful portfolio. And one of the things I love about it is that it's as though she's playing with the notion of multiplicity and iteration that's embedded in the print medium itself. And I find that really fascinating. And they're so beautiful to look at. Just
I would love to see these someday. I've never seen them in person.
Well, if you come back to the museum after the show closes, we can get the whole portfolio out and look at all.
You and I have a coffee date.
Well, no coffee with the prints, but yeah, in the museum. But yes,
first, then we go look.
Agreed. Okay, excellent. Well, this sort of brings me to the end, when I was just going to say, please come to see the show if you can. We're open by reservation. You just have to reserve a time slot, and free to all visitors on Sundays. My email is also on the Harvard Art Museum's website. So feel free to email me at any point to ask questions about the collection or about prints in general. I'm always available.
And the Malden Public Library, and if you're not in Malden, your public library also has museum passes to the museum, so you can go for free. So
yes, come. That's right, not just Sunday. So Dora, that's all I have. I'm happy to answer any questions or talk more about any of the prints that I showed.
I'm intrigued. I have a quick question. I'm going to throw myself in first. Sorry. The ones where they had done, they were going back and forth. Were there only one, or were any of those monetized? I mean, were they considered, are both happening at the same time? I mean, are they checking and monetizing?
I think so. I think you can't say that it's necessarily one without the other, or rather, you can't dismiss that both aren't a factor. So basically, in the 18th century, states start to have value. Before that, they didn't. Collectors weren't interested in collecting, all the states of a print and all of that. This is really an 18th century phenomenon created by print publishers, print sellers. They sort of create this market demand, and they convince collectors that they need that to understand prints, they have to see all the states of something. So it then becomes a thing, and collectors are competing with each other to collect all of the known states of various prints. So artists start to respond to that by producing states for their work. And so it's sort of like this, both factors are in play. So by the 19th century, this is a really, and I should also say, when this gets codified in the 18th century, a price structure emerges as well. They have different prices for the different states. And it's not that the first state was more, in fact, it wasn't, it was less than the final state, but that was also another enticement. Like collect all these states. It won't cost you that much, just collect all of them. And so by the 19th century, that starts to shift a bit because it starts to become, the print sellers start to use the language of drawings. You see the artist's creativity, a lot of the language I use, frankly. You start to see the artist's hand, the artist's mind at play through these states. And so the price differential shifts and changes, and collectors are adamant that they want to get all of these states. And then you have artists like Felix Buo, who's always producing multiple states for his prints. And he's not just running off one impression of the first state, because that would really be a draft, right? And that's where the language of proof starts to kind of enter in. And if it's only known in one impression, people sometimes call it a proof and all that kind of craziness. But he's producing his earlier states in large runs, if not anticipating a market, at least knowing in the back of his mind, okay, well, this has sale value, or this is something that's commercially valuable. So I'll just do all these runs and have them here, and not necessarily advertise, everywhere or try to flog them, right? But at least have them so that they are available for those discerning collectors. So I think that awareness, I can't ever you have to kind of keep it in the mix. Not that every artist is playing to that demand, but the demand was known, it was real. And I think that just has to be considered.
Did it change the definition of proof? I mean,
yes. So yes, proof is a really tough word in print scholarship, and it gets used differently for every single artist. I mean, pretty much, especially when it comes to the 19th century. And part of it is sometimes it's used, like I was saying, if there's only one or two impressions known of a state, it's often not called a state, it's called a proof, because it's considered so unique, so rare, et cetera, et cetera. And so this is where the terminology starts to, get all convoluted. It's the same thing for Constable and Lucas. A lot of those, the states with Constable's annotations are called proofs. And it's like, okay, but you did this, 15 different times, and sometimes on multiple versions. So yeah, it's sort of it can get all spaghetti together. But
Yeah.
that was one thing I kind of wanted to play around with and think about in this show too. And I did, but I mean, I could have taken it I could have really pushed harder on that aspect. I just didn't want to confuse visitors or feel like it was getting too circular, but it's a very interesting problem, I'd say, in print scholarship. Because, there is so much terminology. You'd expect that it's all explained clearly. It's not.
yeah.
It's not.
Well, and when you get a gift of a print and it's got AP and multiple numbers and 6 things, it really does.
Well, that's the other thing. The artist proof is a whole nother thing, right?
Yeah.
Because that's the artist saying, okay, these are specific reserved impressions that I will do something special with, giving gifts or sell for, a special amount of money or unique amount of money, whatever, a different price. And that's why my show ends really with artistic intent, because especially for the 20th and 21st century, artist intent is more than, whatever any print scholar wants to call anything. It's the artists who are really leading the charge on what you're going to call things, how you're going to catalog them and discuss them. And that just makes the questions even more interesting.
Right, because you look back to any of the print councils that go back to the 1600s, the 1700s, where they would get experts supposedly in the field together to try and codify and define terms. And this is what I brought up, is that, yeah, you throw a bunch of printmakers in a room, and no, you are not going to get everyone to agree on everything, because as soon as you define something, someone who was earning money now won't. And you just, it has never been easy or a clear demarcation on any of the definitions. And so it has always had some elasticity. And as it has moved into contemporary times, that has expanded more, not less.
That's
There's
I
still a
completely
council?
agree with that.
Is there still a council, Carol?
Oh God, there have been some for the French had them, the English, the German, you name it. Sometimes they had internationals. Everybody always, every once in a while says, oh, we should do this. You want to see a throwdown that would make wrestling look tame, is to put 3 dealers, 3 printmakers, professional printers, 3 artist printmakers all in a room and say, define this. And oh my gosh, it's hysterical. It's hysterical to watch.
You know, I think we have to allow for the elasticity because of the elasticity of the medium itself. I mean, artists have always been breaking the rules, like Carolyn was saying about the American artists in the 1960s. Like, you know, they've always been breaking the rules for printmaking. You know, Rembrandt was breaking all the rules, which is why everyone since him still looks to him to see, to see his innovation and to see his moves, right? And that's part of the joy of printmaking, is seeing the rule, breaking it, trying to break it, breaking and inventing a new pathway, forging a new pathway. So the terms they can't be stable, right? Because there's no one size fits all for anything with prints, which is why they're so exciting.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Makes your life harder, but
oh yeah, when you're trying to catalog or to establish
say
some
labels.
sort of system for
As an
organizing
artist?
the collection. Yeah.
it's great.
Well, it's really handy if the artist hands you a label, believe me, because if a print comes without a label, it's just, much more difficult. So, yeah.
Oh, yeah.
Definitely.
I'm looking forward to seeing the show, just because you don't often get to see the variation in the states. So I'm really looking forward to that. Thank you so much.
And it makes so much more sense about the collecting of states, because in our collection, I couldn't figure out, why do we have one, Turner print and we have 7 states of it? Like, why would you wouldn't you want the best one? Why would you want all the others? But it makes perfect sense. There was the sense of collecting all the different varieties to sort of see if you could, I guess, almost like one of those highlight puzzles, see if you could figure out, something missing from the table or something like that. So
Yes, and who really played the market for this was Whistler, because a lot of times there's almost no difference between the different states, but he was deliberately. I mean, this is what my director tells me as the scholar who wrote the catalog raisonné on the artist. She said, yeah, there was no reason to create 15 states for some of these things. He just did it because he knew that there was a market. And so he'd make a tiny little change, and of course, a collector who loved his prints wouldn't be disappointed that there'd be a tiny change, because like you say, in looking for the change, they'd find it, and it's that discovery and the excitement. And so everyone's happy. Yeah.
Yeah.
But Harvard has a lot of states, in part because of the collecting tastes. When the 2 main founding collections were assembled in the 19th century. But beyond that, I mean, why we've collected states beyond that is that they're such incredible teaching tools to really see, because some of these prints like the Prud'hon are so worked up that you can't see the bones of it. But to have a true early state where, parts are missing, or, there's only one technique being employed, to really train the eye of the students that you're working with, it's a tremendous resource.
Oh, yay. Looking forward to our Turner inventory and figuring out states and things. 'Cause we just got a grant to inventory all our 100 and some odd Turner prints, which are all different states and different. So it'll be great fun. So.
It'll keep you busy.
Not me, somebody else. Someone who wants to sit there and go, state, is this really? See, this is the problem, because if something is labeled state one, how would you even know if that's really state one or state two? I mean,
That's where, you know, the rubber hits
Yeah.
the road with the print scholarship. You pull out the catalog raisonné, the most recent recognized authority on the artist, and if that print scholar has done his or her or their job right, everything's described and photographed, ideally. And so you compare the description, and if there's an illustration, with what the print you've got in front of you. But that can be hard, because this is how undescribed states are discovered, right? Looking closely at the print and comparing it, it's like, wait a second, this scholar didn't see this impression.
Yeah.
Or did they, right? Because that's the whole trick of it.
Yeah.
But it's careful work. It's really fun, and not for everyone, but for a lot of us, it's really fun sort of detective work.
now, does this mean that current artists like Carolyn should throw nothing away?
Yes, don't throw anything away.
Like, is everything a potential print, proof, state, whatever we want to call it?
As with many artists in the past, you make an executive decision about what you keep and what gets, shall we say, destroyed, eaten by the dog, torn up for the recycling that no one sees, so that what is left are, shall we say, examples with a bit of clarity compared to some of the others. With any artist, there are a few moments of, shall we say, editing.
And we should assume this of older artists, 17th century, 18th as well, should we not? I mean, that what
For sure.
is really their selection of what they wanted seen.
Yes.
Yeah.
Definitely.
Yeah.
And there are
I'm
some
sure-
artists who didn't want that work visible, as Carolyn's intimating. You know, they didn't want that on the historical record. But that to them was their drafting, that was their process. It was not to be considered because it wasn't final, it wasn't done. Yeah.
Well,
That
and
happens a lot.
especially with etching and engraving, until you pull a proof, it's really hard to tell where your values are, your lights, your darks. And so that is a long history in etching of working to a certain point, pulling a proof so you can then go back and push your darks darker, burnish some things out, recalibrate where your tonal issues are. And it even if you're an expert with etching, you need to see a proof to really be sure what do you have there in the plate. Because it is about the depth of that mark that holds the ink, that clarifies it. And when you're then going to print in addition, the printer is going to ink fairly consistently is the idea, right? And that's a little different than Rembrandt, who is kind of like, I'm going to do this, and then I'm going to do this. And a lot of artists who print their own with etching really play with variable inking, because you can. And with etching, that is really a cornerstone of it.
You know, Carolyn, I had a student ask me the other day, say, why are prints unique if you can print 1,000 of them? And then I kind of blew his mind. I said, okay, imagine yourself pre-printer, pre-technology. You're in the 17th century and you're there and you've got someone inking up this copper plate 1,000 times exactly the same way, exactly. And he's just, whoa. It's like, yes, that is the genius. That's why each one's original, but also that's the genius of the medium.
Mm-hmm. Yeah.
Definitely.
All joy.
So can I ask real quick about the show, the state of, because now we all have to go see it. So how long does it last?
So till January 4th.
Oh, wonderful. Oh, we'll have time. Great. Great. Wonderful.
Well, thank you, Dora. This is such an honor, and it was such a fun evening. Thank you very much for inviting me.
Oh, thank you so much for coming. And thank you for everyone. Any other last questions before we go? Okay, so we're going to thank everyone and thank you again, Carolyn, for joining us. And thank you.
Oh, thank you.
Thank you. Thanks. I think I think we should do more of this. Dialogue is wonderful. I think your coffee's going to be amazing, your get together. But thank you again. And thank you to the Malden Cultural Council for providing us this ability to have. And we look forward to our next in our continuing print series as there's so much to learn. So thank you again, Elizabeth, for being with us. And
Thank you.
have a great night, everyone.
Thank you.
Bye.
Thank you.